Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the Simon Armitage poem Mother Any Distance. Now to begin with, let's take a look at the poet Simon Armitage. Simon Armitage was born in 1963 in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. He was actually recently elected the Oxford Professor of Poetry, and if you go onto the website for the Oxford University, you can find some podcasts of lectures he's delivered on poetry. Really interesting. He's a real exam favourite. He's been in the exam for at least 10 years. His poetry is accessible and contemporary, but it's full of rich language and structure and imagery, so it makes it perfect for the exam because most people can read and understand what he's talking about, but still write lots in their analysis. So the poem Mother Any Distance is taken from the collection Book of Matches, which was published in 1993 by Faber and Faber. And Mother Any Distance is actually taken from the first section of the book, which contains a series of short poems which are supposed to be read in the time that it takes for a match to burn out, hence the title, the Book of Matches. So these poems, including the one that we're going to study today, are supposed to be read in around 20 seconds. None of the poems in this first section actually have a title. They all look like this. They just have the asterisk. And they are untitled poems. So just be careful if you're starting to analyse the importance of the title, because this poem doesn't have a title like the one on the screen, like all of the poems in this first section of the book. And when that's the case, publishers just tend to take the first sort of word or line or phrase and give the poem that as a sort of working title for reference. This is an interesting poem because it has something taking place on a literal, simple, obvious level, but there is also a deeper metaphor explored throughout. So on a literal level, the speaker is talking to his mum, and basically he's moving house, walking around his new place, which is empty, and he's got a tape measure, and with his mum who's helping him, he's measuring up for carpets and curtains and that kind of thing. And she holds the end of the tape measure whilst he moves further and further through the house, calling out numbers before reaching the end of the tape in the loft. Now, on a metaphorical level, this is all about, I'm going to say a young man, but that's suggesting perhaps this is about Armitage himself, and we don't know. This could be a young man or a young woman. Growing in independence. So in terms of love and relationships, which is what many of you are studying this poem for, this poem can be read as covering the changing nature of parent-child relationships. And it compares well with Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy and, of course, Follower by Seamus Heaney. Both of those are analysed on this channel, so do watch the other videos in this playlist. So Mother Any Distance really captures the disjointed, unstable moment in the parent-child relationship when the child becomes their own person. You love your parents, but you need to become your own unique person. You need to develop your own identity. And I think that's one of the reasons it's in the exam. I'm sure you can relate to that, your attitude to your parents changes. So let's have a look at the poem. Mother Any Distance greater than a single span requires a second pair of hands. You come to help me measure windows, pelmets, doors, the acres of the walls, the prairies of the floors. You at the zero end, me with the spool of tape, recording length, reporting meters, centimetres back to base, then leaving up the stairs, the line still feeding out, unreeling years between us, anchor, kite. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms, climb the ladder to the loft, to breaking point, where something has to give. 2 floors below, your fingertips still pinch the last 1/100th of an inch. I reach towards a hatch that opens on an endless sky to fall or fly. So a fairly simple poem on the literal level. Now we're going to analyse language, structure and form. Let's begin with form because that's the one most people don't analyse, so this will help you to get ahead in the exam. Now Mother Any Distance is loosely based on the form of a sonnet, and I say loosely, and that's important, we'll talk about that. So the sonnet is a genre of love poetry which originated in Italy in the 13th century. But in the 14th century we have the poet Petrarch, seen here. He's the most recognised Italian sonneteer, and his story is that he fell in love with a woman that we know as Laura, and wrote 366 sonnets to her. But it was unrequited love. She rejected his proposals. Now, the Italian sonnet follows the form of 14 lines. The first 8, the octave, present a problem, which the last 6, the sestet, solve. In line 9, there's a volta, a sharp twist, and it has the ABBA rhyme scheme. Now, moving on from that, in the 16th century, the sonnet made its way into English poetry. Sir Philip Sidney developed it, but it came to be known as the Shakespearean sonnet after Shakespeare made it truly famous. And the form is quite different to the Petrarchan sonnet. It's written in iambic pentameter, lines of 10 syllables, which alternate stressed and unstressed syllables, divided into 3 verses of 4 lines each, known as quatrains, finished with a rhyming couplet, which also serves as the volta, and its rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. But the topic of a Shakespearean sonnet remains the same. They're all about love. So is Mother Any Distance a sonnet? Well, in some ways it is. There are, let's look at the obvious difference. There are 15 lines rather than 14. But if you look at this 15th line, it's very small, and that is deliberately placed as an extra additional thought on its own to make us think carefully about it. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So it could easily have been 14 lines. It's deliberately placed into 15. The poem does end with the rhyming couplet on sky and fly, like the Shakespearean sonnet. There is an octave in the first 8 lines, which presents a problem. And you might want to discuss in your class, what is the problem that's being presented? One way to look at it, and there's no kind of set in stone way, but it almost seems that the problem being presented is, Mum, I need you, but I'm held back by you. And I'll talk about that further in a second. And then the sestet, the final 6 or 6 and a little bit lines here, solve that problem, in the solution being, well, the child has to do their own thing, for good or for bad. So it does follow some of the rhymes of the sonnet, but there are a number of ways in which the poem challenges the sonnet form, mostly in the rhyme scheme. There's a little bit of rhyme, but there's no specific rhyme scheme. There's some internal rhyme, there is some end rhyme, but no organised rhyme scheme particularly. Similarly, the lines do not contain the same amount of syllables. This certainly isn't iambic pentameter. So as always with poetry, we can find something about language structure or form, but we've got to link it to the themes, to the meaning of the poem. It's no good to just say, yes, it's a bit of a sonnet, but also it's not. We've got to say, well, what does that tell us about the relationship here? Well, I think that the unstable use of the sonnet form reflects the way in which the narrator does love his mother, because we see the use of the sonnet form, which in itself is a form of love poetry, but the nature of the relationship at this crucial point in their lives is unstable. It's changing as it moves from something it was to something new. Given the direct address of the poem, the mother, the writing to the mum, you came to help me, we could even say that the poem seems to be a way for the speaker to say, Mum, I still love you. It's just that the nature of our relationship is changing. As I move into my own place, I still need you, I still value your input and your help, but I am moving metaphorically away from you and becoming my own independent person. So that's the way the form is used. Now, structure. What can we say about the structure of the poem? Well, one thing we can say as we look at the poem on the screen here is there is no fixed rhyme scheme. There are varying lengths of lines, and that means that everything is uncontrolled and unpredictable. And that reflects the way that the relationship is uncontrolled now and unpredictable. This is new ground. This is a new stage. There is no formulaic pattern to follow because everything is new. So the lack of fixed rhyme scheme and the varying length of lines reflects the uncontrolled, unpredictable nature of the relationship. There is some structural contrast, though. There is a lot of enjambment in the poem where the sentences continue on to different lines. So here we have you at the zero end, me with the spool of tape, recording length, reporting meters, centimeters back to base, then leaving up the stairs, the line still feeding out and reeling years between us. And that sentence goes over 4 lines. That's enjambment. So the structure there of deciding to make the poem or these lines go over, this sentence go over numerous lines, is a structure point, because it is then deliberately contrasted with anchor, kite, which are one word and then a full stop. So why have this sort of really fast flowing structural choice of enjambment and then contrast it with anchor and kite? Well, let's think about the words anchor and kite and why they are deliberately emphasized through the use of the full stop. I actually thought to get a picture of an anchor and a kite, I would just show you some tattoos that I found on Google, because I spent way too long trying to look for a picture of an anchor that actually made it clear what an anchor does. So an anchor and a kite, this is now language analysis, of course, but it's structure analysis in the significance of why they have full stops next to them and why they're structurally juxtaposed, if you like, put next to the long example of enjambment. So what does an anchor do and what does a kite do? Well, an anchor holds you down, keeps you safe and holds you in place. If you're on a ship and you're sailing and you want to stop, you drop the anchor and you stop. It's like putting the brakes on. A kite, although it seems to have that freedom in flying around in the sky, is still held down by the person holding the rope. So you could say that both an anchor and a kite bring stability, but they also hold you in one place. So what's happening here? These words suggest being held back. And the sentence structure reflects that conflict, because you could say that the enjambment and the free-flowing structure here represents what the speaker wants in this sense of freedom. And then it's contrasted with this sentence structure of the full stops here, which is, of course, caesura, which is where you use punctuation to create a pause or a stop in a sentence, in a poem. And it reflects the difference between the mother and the child, but also there is the language analysis of the imagery of why anchor, why kite. So that's the anchor and kite imagery in the tattoos, and I thought we'd just think about the ending now as a structure point. The final line, to fall or fly, breaks the sonnet form. It forces a very bizarre rhyme, because that line does actually rhyme. It does rhyme with towards a hatch that opens on an endless sky. But of course the difference in the length of the line makes the rhyme very forced and very kind of unnatural. Okay, so let's have a think about it. It also stands out, of course, because it's the shortest line in the entire poem. So for a number of reasons, because this line really does break the rules of the sonnet, because it makes it 15 lines rather than 14. Because it forces a very bizarre rhyme because of the length difference in the lines, and because it just stands out as being the shortest line in the entire poem, those three things are used to emphasize the importance of this line. And I think it highlights the fact that the child is admitting that they may or may not succeed in this independent life. To fall or fly is imagery of birds in the nest, which I'll explore in a minute. But as the poem is directed to the mother, this structural isolation of this point emphasises its importance. It's as if the speaker is saying, Mum, I'm not saying I know how this will go, but I need to do it. And in that, you could say that the speaker refuses to lay blame at the mother's feet. This is something they have to do. It's not a case of, I know better, it's just a case of I need to do this. So now let's have a look at the language in the poem. The word acres is an interesting one, because this is hyperbole. An acre is about 5,000 square yards, so it's exaggeration for effect. And I actually think when you deliberately over-exaggerate things, that can be quite a childish idea. And there's a lot of childish imagery used in the poem. So we see the word prairies. Now, a prairie is a large open area of grassland, mostly in North America. And there's some irony here in the obviously childish frame of reference. Using a metaphor we might expect the speaker to have read in a boy's adventure story about the Wild West and cowboys. And similarly, the use of span for measurement is a very childish measurement. The last time I measured anything in a span was in primary school, hand span and arm span. So I think there's a deliberate use of childish imagery in the hyperbole of acres, in the naive use of prairies, or the childish use of prairies, and the use of span as a measurement, which reminds us of childhood. And I think this can be interpreted in a number of ways. It could be worrying evidence that the narrator is not mature enough to live on their own, that they will fall, not fly. Or it could be a deliberate usage of childish language and references to remind the mother, who of course is being spoken to, of the past that the two have shared together as the child was growing up. Now, throughout the poem, the measuring tape is used as a metaphor. And on a simple level, as the speaker moves further away from his mother, the physical distance between them symbolises the relational difference that is growing between the two of them. So you at the zero end, me with the spool of tape. But there's more than that. You see, the mum holds one end and the son the other. And the tape, I think, is presented as a kind of umbilical cord between the two. You know, the umbilical cord is this bit. I tell you what, I googled umbilical cord and I got some really graphic real life pictures, and I was like, I've got to find a drawing. But this is the umbilical cord, that when you're in the womb, you know, this tube sort of feeds you through your belly button all the nutrients that you need, and it is a connection between a mother and a child. And I think the tape is a little bit like a symbolic of an umbilical cord, that connection, that essential connection to life, which exists between the two. So the metaphor of the zero end then is interesting, because when is a child at the zero end? You know, we don't say when a baby is born, oh yeah, there's zero, you know. And you could say that the zero end is the moment in the womb for a baby. And this reminds the reader that the son and mother have been connected from conception and growth in the womb, the zero end of life. And this is further explored in the use of spacewalk imagery. I spacewalk through the empty bedrooms. There's this imagery of space exploration. Now, one thing I think is interesting in this is when you're, going out like this picture here from the spaceship, you also are connected by this life-giving cord, like the umbilical cord, like the tape, which connects you to life, to everything that you need back at base, as Armitage might have done it. And of course, base is another one of the childish images that we see in the poem as well. So, of course, there is this umbilical cord imagery, but also, what is space? What is space? What is space exploration all about? Well, it's about exploring uncharted territory. It's exciting, but there's a risk too, and that is definitely presented in this poem. The imagery of space is significant in this and other Armitage poems. In The Straight and Narrow, the child Armitage views adult working life as the clouds opened up and we were leaving the past. So this is similar imagery to that in Mother Any Distance, where Armitage sees the endless sky as the beginning of independent life. So contextually across the poems of Armitage, there is this idea that space and open space and the sky represents independence and the future. So finally, let's look at the bird imagery in the poem. There's a double meaning in the word hatch. On the literal level, he's just talking about the door into the loft, but the word comes from the lexical field of birds, doesn't it? And of course, therefore, gets us thinking about the bird imagery. And it introduces or instigates the imagery of the bird flying the nest. What does that mean? Well, here's the situation. When a bird is hatched in a nest like this one here, for a long time, it stays in the nest for various time, not necessarily a long time. And the mum and dad, they spend their whole day, I've got a nest right in front of my office. The mum and dad spend their whole day going out and getting worms and things like that for the chicks to eat. But there comes a point when a chick has to just get out and fly. And you might have seen that in nature programs, sometimes very, very sad, that the chick, as we see in the picture here, it has to jump out of the nest. And of course, the nest is high up to protect from predators, ground predators. So what happens is the bird or the chick begins to fall to the floor. And it has, 1 second to understand what it needs to do and to fly for the first time ever. And parents quite often talk about flying the nest as an image, of leaving the house. It's a bit like the same image of a child when they leave home. So there's a link there. But I also think that there's another link, which is the fact that This is a risk. There's only one shot, as Eminem would say. The bird is going to jump out of the nest and begin falling to the ground, and the speaker is acknowledging the seriousness of the situation here. The blunt final line shows this. The speaker in the poem knows, look, Mum, I'm doing this, but it could go wrong. You know, this is serious, and I'm not taking it lightly. Well, that's my analysis of the poem. I hope you found it useful. I do have a poetry revision guide at mrbruff.com, which contains 10 of the poems from across the exams. Not this one, because this one's in copyright, but you know, the detailed notes on lots of them. So check that out. It's got a list of all the ones that are involved. It's £3.99 at mrbruff.com.